Hi guys, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're joined by Marlene and we're going to talk all about being a founder, being a young founder, being a young female founder. So I hope you enjoy this episode. And Marlene, can you please start by introducing yourself?
Yes, of course. So, hi guys, I'm Marlene. I'm the co founder of The Graduate Guide, which is a startup in the early career space. And we basically help students and graduates get into the startup world either by starting their own company or by working for really, really great founders and startups in the UK. And yeah, I've been building that company for over a year now. And before then, I was a student in London. So, yeah, really happy to be here and talk about whatever. Yeah.
Incredible. So before we start talking a little bit more about your journey with the Graduate Guide and what you're building right now, let's go back into how you came about into this role. So you've studied your master's in entrepreneurship, but did you know starting off at university and going into thinking about career that you wanted to be an entrepreneur and a founder?
No, and I still like to this day think like the word entrepreneur is kind of cringe, and I sort of struggle always thinking like how should I introduce myself to new people about what I do. And some people are really bold and confident with that. They're like, oh, I'm an entrepreneur, but to me it just always sounds a bit performative. So no, when I was at university, I was not really into entrepreneurship at all. I was more like a social science girl, really liked studying sociology and just learning about different social issues. And yeah, and my perception of entrepreneurship was very male coded, Elon Musk type thing. Like that sort of was my idea of what an entrepreneur is. And it seems very inaccessible and almost unfeasible to ever become someone to that level. And I was not really familiar with the option or like even the possibility of doing anything myself at such a young age. So it was not something I ever thought I would go into. But then I did an internship at a company called Ashoka, and they basically sponsor social entrepreneurs around the world. So to help them quit their full-time job and focus fully on the social venture that they have built. And by working there, I met so many different founders, like from all around the world, working on problems in different geographies, and just kind of learning that they're like just random people who see a problem and get really into it and trying to solve it. And that sort of really opened up my eyes to what entrepreneurship actually is, which is not as strictly defined by sort of the most mediated people. And yeah, and then that's kind of how it awoke my interest. And ever since then, I actually love how diverse entrepreneurship is and how many different people are in it and how many different, in all industries with all types of ideas. And yeah, I think it's actually very rich as a community, and yeah, happy to talk more about that. But yeah.
Awesome. Well, so you kind of talked about how you had this misconception of
Mm.
what it is. And I'm sure that's something that many of the people who are watching will feel as well, where they don't feel like it's something that is for them. So if you were to like say something to the people who are watching or something to a younger version of yourself, how would you explain entrepreneurship and your experience of it like firsthand rather than how it's portrayed in this kind of Elon Musk style of how you said
Yeah.
before?
I think entrepreneurship at its core just means that you look around in your immediate environment and think about how you can make something better. And usually that involves establishing a business, but I don't think it has to be. I think it can be a charity, right? You can work on it more on a project basis by just having a community based organization. But I think all of these forms are entrepreneurial work. And I think that's also how many people start out, right? They just look around in the immediate surrounding and think to themselves, like, how can I make things better for people or clearer for people? And yeah, I think that's what it is at its core. And I think you do kind of have to focus on a very specific problem that you're passionate about solving so that you can have a bit of a measured impact, right? And what would I say to my younger self? Good question. I think to just be a little bit more open minded and to look a little bit beyond what sort of people say entrepreneurship is on social media and talk to real people. And I think I was very much more trapped in sort of the idea that entrepreneurship is very toxic and unethical as well. Like, I never wanted to even do stuff like Jeff Bezos. I thought, okay, well, he's really rich, great for him. But then I think, working condition at Amazon factories are like outrageously bad. And I didn't really see a way to make money and be successful without being very unethical. And I think being more open-minded on that, like, really helped me then like entrepreneurship for myself. Yeah.
That's
Hope that
incredible.
makes sense. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
that's so cool. And I love that you kind of explored that working with social enterprises to start off with. And so now we've discussed that. Can you tell us a little bit more about the graduate guide and what it is and how you started and got involved with it?
Yeah. So I think how I got involved was I studied entrepreneurship at university, and I just wanted to work for a startup, or I thought that's sort of was what my first job was going to be like. And I sort of like dabbled a little bit in entrepreneurship myself and tried out different things. Had like a company called Niz and built it up and was trying to be part of it. And it was great, but I didn't really see it like succeeding or being like financially stable enough for me to just do that straight after university. So the plan was to work for someone else, but then I met my co-founder Peter through LinkedIn, and he basically invited other students to come and interview founders. And I'm like, oh, this is smart, because in this way I can meet cool founders and just meet them through a podcast setting, and that way hopefully get a job in a very informal way. That sort of was my plan. But no, and then what actually ended up happening is I just got along really well with my co-founder, and we were both really passionate about entrepreneurship ourselves and trying stuff ourselves. And I think we both just kind of said, okay, let's give it a go, and we see how it goes. I think in the beginning we didn't really have even a concrete idea of what exactly we wanted to help solve and do. And like even to this day, I feel on like a monthly basis, it always slightly changes, and you becoming more refined about what exact problem you're tackling and what exact solution you want to build to solve it. But I think the best thing that we've done is just try out a lot of different things and sort of build a community of people that we want to serve, because even then when you slightly alter what you offer, you still have the momentum, and it's sort of less scary to do changes and iterate. So yeah, so I think today what essentially we want to do and solve is, we perceive like the UK to be in a very bad career crisis, especially for young people. And it's obviously, with the current economic climate, getting increasingly hard to find a fulfilling role upon graduation, or even sort of 1-2 years after graduation. You might start somewhere, realize it's not for you, and then what do you do? So I think there is a huge gap between very talented graduates who have a lot to offer and startups who are looking for talent. And hiring in startups, because of lack of money, lack of channels, or lack of brand and marketing, has always happened very informally through sort of obscure networks. And that can be effective for some startups and founders if they have the right network. But on the other hand, for a lot of startups and founders, they don't have the people straight in their network that they would like to hire. And then obviously it needs to be quite immediate, and you need to grow fast. So we basically want to bring these two groups together, and think there's a lot of potential on helping graduates find fulfilling careers and startups that actually can, I think, be to a degree more rewarding than corporate if it's something for you. And yeah, on the other hand, help startups find talent. So that's kind of where we're scrambling around mostly. And then because we are very passionate about helping people also build their own startups, we kind of offer that as well, and make some events, for people who are just curious about entrepreneurship. Maybe they don't know if it's something that they want to pursue and build for them, or they're just curious to meet founders. So we're like a very low barrier introductory community to entrepreneurship, where we have people who are more actively working on their businesses but in the very beginning, or people who are just curious to be in that space. And even if you work for a founder, you should be familiar with what it means to be an entrepreneur and the challenges that come with it. So we think that these two demographics can be combined quite nicely, and that's sort of how we've been building a brand amongst young people, because that's what you need to do and sort of build that trust. And yeah, I hope that was a lot of talking. I hope that that kind of explains what we do. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And as someone who is a member of your community,
Yeah.
I find it really interesting. The community is called Grads Building Companies, by the way, check it out. I'll link it down below. But you've just started. It's only a few months in, and in the events that I've been to, first of all, there's always really interesting people at those events. And also I see the same faces, which means that people come back.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really hard thing to do, to create a community from scratch, because like, how do you assure people that they're going to get value from being in a room? And that's something that can be really difficult. And that's what a lot of people try to do, whether they do it on digital platforms by creating an online community, or they start like an events business in a similar way to what you've done. So my next question to you is, like, how are you intentionally creating that community so that it helps people and people can gain value out of it? Like, it's a really difficult thing to do.
Yeah, I think it's really difficult to do. I think the big question that I think I would recommend people ask themselves is like, what is the purpose of this community? And sometimes you can have a mission, but then the next question is like, to what degree is this scalable? Right? So and then you have to basically know, what type of business do you want to build, right? Do you want to build a more small scale lifestyle business where you like likely you're not going to raise investment, but you just like invest your resources and keep it more like manageable for maybe yourself and 2-3 other employees, and that's kind of what you run with? But then like it gets more complicated when you say like, no, I want to have really large scale impact and move a lot more people than I'm capable to do with a 3-people team. So then the next question is, well, then how do you scale that? And I think it comes down a lot to really thinking about what's the point of the community and what type of business you actually want to build. And I think then people are able to answer a lot of questions for themselves. But community is very tricky, and it's also a bit of a buzzword. And a lot of businesses will say, oh, we have a community. And it might be like a kind of dead WhatsApp group with, 5,000 numbers in it, and that's the community. But I think community is great if you actually have something to give. And I think the nice thing of sort of working in that career space is that it does require a lot of education, and a lot of people, despite going to top unis, don't really have access to professional people that can help them, guide them in their career, or give an insight into their professional life. And I think even at university, it's largely students who put on these events, right? Like at societies, and they invite people. And I think that can be great to a degree. But then it sort of also depends on who do the students know, and who can they get into the room. And I think that's kind of where we come in, because we are so well connected in the startup world, that we just can get really great speakers who can sort of help students out. And sometimes what you give to your community can be very simple, and you think like, oh, you have to deliver so much value. But like what we have seen, and what we've gotten a lot from community feedback, is that what people most enjoy is just like coming together on a regular basis, being inspired, right? You can watch so much educational content online, but I think like going to an event and feeling like there's cool people there, and there was a great speaker, like that can be so uplifting, and you don't have to overcomplicate it as a community manager. So yeah, there's like lots of things to think about, but for like our one specifically, the main things I've learned is just to like keep it lean, keep it simple, really listen to the members in it, and see like how you go from there, obviously. So I think that's kind of my take on community. Yeah.
That's super interesting. And again, as someone who's been to some of your events, it's really interesting because you've mentioned you're trying to create a lot of value for the people who attend, and the students and the grads. And one of the ways that you've managed to do that is you've had some really interesting speakers. And that can be quite difficult when you're starting out to like get people to come and speak at an event, or even when you have a podcast, getting people to come and give up their time to speak with you. So if people watching this are wanting to work with people who are high profile or doing something that is really important in the world of business or whatever, what advice would you give them for cold outreach to convince people to come to work with them?
I think you need to have real clarity on like why you are inviting someone and be good in communicating that. But I think what mostly stops people from reaching out to people they think they cannot talk to is that they just don't do it. It sounds a bit strange, but I think like often you're like, oh no, this person is too high caliber. They're not going to give up their time. I'm going to reach out to someone else. And you don't even try, even though it doesn't cost anything. So there's actually a really interesting founder. His name is Ariel, and he's building his company in Paris. And his company is called Augment, and it's an online MBA. And he wanted to create like a sort of masterclass course where he interviews top business people and top founders and does really high quality content with them, and then sort of make like a 2K online MBA out of that. Like actual have not like a university where you pay 100K, but sort of have real business people explain to you how they made huge companies and how you can navigate sort of the world of business in like a 2K course, right? So if you're actually doing an MBA, not for the CV, but the value you're hoping to get out of it, maybe that's like a much cheaper option for you. And he randomly, for when he did it at first, he just emailed really high profile founders, like the founder of Shazam, I think he has. And like I think I don't know if Wikipedia, but like really really successful people, and he just reached out with a very concrete request from them. He's like, hey, this is who we are, this is what we're building, this is what we're looking for, are you interested in potentially taking part and having that conversation? And he reached out to like a couple of people. Some people ghosted him, some people said no, but actually really high profile people just ended up saying, hey, this sounds really cool, yes. And so I think like sometimes, you know, you are your worst enemy. Like you think, oh no, like they're never going to say yes to this, I'm not even going to try. And I think that's like the same with anything. And then kind of once you've had a couple of high profile people on, because the world of entrepreneurship is so small, it's like much easier to then get other people to come. So I think it's just that first hurdle to just like try and be comfortable with getting ghosted or getting some no's. And then hey, if a couple of people say yes, like that's fantastic. So I think that's like how you, and that's like a lesson for anything, right? It's not just like about sort of speakers in a community or podcast. It's also like when you have a business and you need to sell to companies or to people, right? Like I think it takes a lot of courage to like just craft a message and reach out, or even if you do sort of cold calling, which can be very uncomfortable. Yeah, I think the main way to get good at it is just doing it, and then sort of seeing like and reflecting on like why did people say no, or like why did they even say yes, and then like going with what works. But it can be scary, and like I'm not the best person myself at constantly networking and meeting new people. And I think also a lot of business is done in a very non-salesy way, which is a bit difficult to navigate. So like sometimes, especially if you work in B2B, it's like people that like you working with you because they mostly like you as a person, and the services that you offer are good, right? But it's mostly like, oh, you want to help each other out, and that's why they buy from this supplier and not that supplier type of thing. So that's like what I have found is that's a lot more about like being there as a person and being likable and friendly and sort of obviously having value to deliver, but at the end of the day, we're all humans, and even the person that you're having like a sales call with wants to feel heard and like comfortable and stuff. So yeah, I think when I was young, I always thought it was like very like cold outreach, say yes or no right now, otherwise I'm never going to talk to you again. But actually the best clients that Pete and I have were sort of sweet talked over like a longer period of time, and then they like really started ending up liking our mission, and it took much longer to get there, especially with the first clients. And it's just not like, oh, this is what we do. Do you want it? Yes or no? Like my German brain was very much like, this is how it works. But it really doesn't. It's much more about, establishing a rapport and getting someone kind of interested in you and what you really do, and then I think they're much more likely to convert. And that goes for anything, right? Getting speakers, getting podcast guests. Like, I like you as a person, so like, of course I'm gonna come on your podcast, like, no questions asked. Like, I think it's great what you do and it's inspiring, and then humans are so simple, like they want to be part of that, right? So I think that's kind of what I have found works the best, is just doing it. Yeah.
That's awesome, and I like you as
Yeah.
a person a lot as well.
Thank you.
What you said was really interesting, because you talked about just do it, but you also talked about how some of the best leads for you have been ones that you've had to kind of follow up. And I think something that's really interesting is that in my case as well, with this podcast, there's been people that I've reached out to who have ghosted me the first time,
Yeah.
but I've had to follow up like twice, maybe thrice, and then they'll be like, oh, sorry, I didn't see this. Yes, of course. So I think following up is a big art in itself as well.
Yeah.
And that can feel a little bit cringe, because you're like, oh, you don't want to be like spamming someone or being overwhelming or being too much. So do you have any advice specifically on how to deliver an effective follow-up? And how you can make sure that you're actually not just sending someone the same message again and again and again, but continuing to convey why someone should work with you?
Yeah, I think it depends a little bit, obviously, what is the purpose of sort of the interaction. I think, like, typically I would say, if you send 3 messages to someone and they don't get back on the third one, like, maybe let it be and reach out, like, in a couple of months. Like, it was not the right time. Maybe they're not interested. You weren't at a point. Like, also don't get too hung up on people, because I think if someone, like, there's these people on LinkedIn who want to, sell something to us, and they message me like 5-6 times, and I'm just like, ugh, like, yeah, I could just write you a simple message, no, I'm not interested. But I think a lot of people sometimes, when it's not their highest priority, even properly reading something and saying, no, I don't want this now, is work. So they just like put it off, right? So I think it comes down to like saying, okay, this is what I want out of it, and then like you put yourself out first, and then you don't hear back. Like, what can be a creative follow-up is, for example, say, for your podcast, okay, they didn't get back first time, maybe send another message, say like, hey, recently recorded this episode with someone, put in the link, we think you'd be great for, talking about this topic, are you interested in coming on? So that kind of altering a little bit how you pitch something. And sometimes it can also just, it's much easier to get someone to help out on something than selling to them. So for example, if you have like, say, oh, my podcast is meant to help like young women or young founders get better at this, do you want to come and talk? I think a lot of people love giving back and love sharing what they've learned. So that can be a nice way, right? And also sometimes the first like foot into the door is offering something to them. If you're selling a product, for example, what Peter and I do is like, we do some stuff for free first. Like, we say, okay, well, no strings attached. We can just, create a small talent pool for you that you can hire from, and you don't have to pay us for it. Or like, you only have to pay us if you end up hiring someone from it. So kind of think about what can be some things that you can offer for free that helps out a little bit. And then maybe it goes really well. Like, obviously people do multiple hires. So if one of them goes well and we've done it for very, very cheap or even for free, like, they're more likely to come back the next time. So especially in this learning stage, and you're like suffering and you feel like no one is interested in what you have to give, maybe take a step back and think like, okay, maybe if I don't have to ask for money for it straight away, like, what can I do to help out for free to a degree, and then get to know them and they get to know me. And that's where the selling usually happens, is that there's some initial connection established where you just meet more as humans. That's what I've seen, what works the best. And my co-founder is much better at that type of stuff than me as well. But I just look at how he does it and then like kind of copy it. But yeah, he really is good at like, schmoozing people a little bit. And and doing that first. And it works well. Like, it's not, he doesn't do it in a fake way, obviously. It's like his authentic self, but he's not straight up jumping into like that part of like, oh, now I want to sell to you type thing. It's just more like even aligning and learning about them and their businesses and stuff. So more listening than talking, I think, is good. But yeah, I hope that makes sense. But it's complicated, and I think there are like tools out there that you can use to kind of be more effective and strategic at follow-ups. Like, it can also be a quant game, like document stuff, right? Have a CRM, like if you're actually selling something. HubSpot has good tips, but I think usually tips online are like more, they all come across a bit inauthentic. Like, you have to really think, what's my language and how do I talk and what is my service, and then like rather not use any templates from online or ChatGPT. Like, think more like, how can you authentically craft a message, and usually that works better. But yeah, that's like my take on it. But yeah, hope that makes sense.
Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
Before I ask you my next thing, just for anyone who's watching and doesn't know what it means, can you just quickly explain what CRM is?
Yeah, so CRM is like customer relation management, I think what it stands for. See, I don't even know. But it basically is, well, you can imagine it like an Excel form where you have all of your like contacts that you ever spoke to, and you kind of categorize them as like a lead or like a warm lead, and then you create some sub stages to the conversion process until you like sell to them or get them to come on, right? Or whatever it is you do. And I think this can also be really effective for basically anything, even if you're doing like interviews of people for research. You actually document, okay, who have I spoken to, and like what is the next follow-up step I need to do. And especially if you do this like large scale, your brain will forget. And that's kind of what it's used for. It's like a contact, a more sophisticated like Excel sheet contact base, essentially.
Nice.
Yeah.
I'll link some more information about that down
Yeah, for
in
sure,
the
for sure.
description. But I also want to touch on something you said earlier about like people work with people they like. And I think a lot of who you like can be people who remind you of yourself and look like you, and something that brings in this whole complex conversation about diversity in work and in entrepreneurship, and how it's a very male dominated space. It's a very white space. There's like older people as well. There's a lot of different ists and isms that are kind of subtly concealed. So what has been your experience navigating that, and do you have any advice to diverse young founders who are watching this who might need a foot in the door?
Yeah, like it's a tough experience. I think the first step is just to acknowledge it. I don't like, some people they go a bit like anti this discourse, and they say like, no, like my diversity is purely my strength and there's sort of no boundaries to what I can do. And like, I agree, like there isn't, right? And it doesn't matter if you're a minority, and it doesn't matter if you're, for example, the only woman in the room, like you still deserve to be there. And it's true, like there aren't any real existing boundaries to what you can do. But I think for especially, it is still good to see and good to acknowledge that like some things are just easier for people that aren't minorities. And like that is in business, that is especially white men. And I don't think it has really changed. And it's very interesting because my co-founder is a white man, so I see it more on like a regular, even daily basis. It's just how do people interact with him versus with me. And I think like when he gets to know people, it's through a very casual way, and they're like, oh, mate, like straight away. And he goes like, for example, we're doing a fundraise right now, and that involves talking to a lot of investors, and then some investors invite him to go play like squash with him or go for a run for the first meetup, which is like very strange. And even he is a bit careful with these type of things, because you don't want to obviously meet anyone creepy. But like as a woman, it's just like there's always an afterthought of, okay, this is like a middle-aged man and I am a young woman, and like how do I best navigate this dynamic? And I don't want to message an investor at midnight on WhatsApp. Like I think that's a bit strange. But if you're like on a mate basis, whatever, right? So I think like because I think of like pure elements of women being often perceived as objects or like more in a sexual way, I think to this day it's much easier when there's no element of that whatsoever, right? Like even if there's a big age gap between us, older man will be like, oh, I can see myself in this young man and how ambitious, and that's what you connect with. While like I think because of patriarchy, it makes it way more complex for women. And then minorities, there's further issues and like stereotypes like built into it, right? So, but I can like mostly, obviously I'm white, but like I can mostly more talk about like my experience as a woman. And then, yeah, and it's not easy. I think like people mean well, usually. And uh, it's rare that you meet like people who are like outright sexist, but it can also be more about like the micro messages that you get, where like I'm called the lady and my co-founder is called the founder, and I'm like, well, I'm not the lady, I'm the co-founder, even if you don't know my name. So you're sort of like more often reduced to your like identity as a woman. And I think if you're a man, your masculinity or like your male identity is just blind, like it's the neutral thing. And then so it's like the zero, and then if you're like the woman, it's not the standard, so then it gets more highlighted and there's a light shined on it, or you get treated a bit differently. But you don't as a man, it's like the standard. And I think that's kind of what it feels like. Now that doesn't mean that you can't like be successful or do something, but it's just a little bit harder or a little bit different. And there's also lots of studies on this. So obviously, like from more like beyond my like analogies or personal stories, like I've done like for my master thesis, I've done research on like women's experiences fundraising in the UK, and yeah, like statistically, even people before me have done research on this, that women get asked more like risk related questions, for example, on their decks, right? So men get more questions about opportunities. Now, and then like that has consequences. So if you imagine you have a conversation with someone and you only ask them questions about risks, after the conversation you'll feel like, oh, that's a bit of a risky business, isn't it? But if you ask someone only questions about opportunities or more questions, you feel like, oh, this business has a lot of opportunities and it's great. I'm gonna invest in this. So that has like real consequences for the outcomes of investor decisions. And it's important to know this as a woman, so that as a consequence of that, you can better prepare for risk-related questions and hopefully sort of turn them around and say more opportunity things like, okay, address the risk, but then as a follow-up say, but this is how we plan to overcome it, and this is why we still think it's going to work, etc. So yeah, it's important to like look at yourself as a woman in this space and then like learn how to best navigate it. So I don't think it's useful or productive to just pretend you're not a woman and pretend it's not an issue and pretend it's not there, because like statistically that's not the reality. And you will encounter situations where you will feel like, oh, that comment was only said because I'm a woman, or stuff like that. So that's kind of my take on it. Like it's more authentic to say like, okay, this is the case, than like to just say, it's not an issue, like ignore it. And people who complain about this is just, an excuse for their failures or something like that. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And what I find so fascinating about your case is that not only have you got lived experience of this, but you did your master's thesis on this, on the funding gap. And when I was reading it, you were talking about how there's a difference between also teams that are mixed. So like in your case, you have a male co-founder and you're a mixed team, but there's also like a further division for female-only teams.
Yeah.
And all of that. So what did your research highlight about that? And how do you think, aside from what you said about opportunities and risk and how you position yourself, are there any other tips that young female founders or just female founders in general can use to give themselves more of a chance?
Yeah, I think I have like lots of different perspectives on this, right? You said my personal, my research-based one, but also I've spoken with a lot of different female founders for my research and on a personal level, and I also know a lot of people from the venture capital space. And like how do I say this? From a pure monetary perspective, they do not care if you're a man or a woman because they just want their money back. They want to invest in a profitable company. So I know that there are venture firms who have set targets for diversity, but for the core of their business, it matters little, and they know that they're just looking for a return on investment, right? So because of the nature of this business, there is little reason of why you should give so much attention or capital to founders who are like minorities, right? From a pure business perspective. Now, there are obviously, people who are trying to change this. But that's, I think, why it's been so slow and so frustrating is that like we've probably had this conversation for a decade now, more intensely. And the amount that goes to women still depends on the year, but between 2 and 4% is sort of the numbers I found. So this is for startups that are only women led. And I haven't seen such a crazy gender gap in the Western world on anything than this. But this has huge consequences for the economy because it means that if most companies are founded by men, they're probably solving more issues related to men or both genders. And then these are the people that shape our economy. These are the people that employ people, that, build huge companies that employ maybe like, hundreds of people at some point. So I think like, yeah, it has like a real impact, not just for like, the founders themselves, but like for everyone else as well. And especially there's more studies coming out that women are actually very good in leadership positions, right? Like obviously now, since like the 70s and 80s, we've seen like more women in leadership positions. And most leadership positions are about dealing with complicated people, right? And women like are more socially trained to be good at these things and have higher EQs. So there are like lots of benefits to having more women leaders in your company. And there's also interesting studies that come out that women are very investable and are actually deliver more stable returns on investment because they're not as risk prone, right? So they don't tend to make such risk-prone decisions, which can lead to, the company going bankrupt or something like that. And companies that are led by like female CEOs also score higher on like the returns that they make, so etc. So from a pure quantitative point of view, women are arguably more investable, but no one cares. Why? Because I think pure bias, confirmation bias. I think men have more comfort being very confident with their idea. And I think most women, like on average, are taught not to be so confident or forward with this. And of course, it harms you because you're selling like an idea, a mission to investors, right? So then that comes in, or like more, like most venture capital firms, it's men who make these decisions on the board, and then they mostly invest in men because they just relate to them more and to the problems that they solve, right? Women tend to often solve problems that are more relevant for women because that's what they care about and that's what they've seen. And then there's less aspiration or more question marks. Like, for example, beauty and beauty tech are huge markets. And as a woman, that's kind of, how much money you spend on makeup and skincare, and that is everywhere on your Instagram, and that's a huge topic. But like a 45-year-old man won't know. So you have to be much more convincing on that market statistic, right? But sometimes like our brains are very simple, and if you don't know about something, you'll just think like, oh, that's not a big thing to invest in. So I think that's kind of why this happens, beyond just like, yeah, more general stereotypes. But it's sad, and even for mixed teams, like I mean, this is obviously statistics and not that it applies, but uh, my co-founder Peter, just by having me as a co-founder, as a woman, he statistically reduces his chances of raising investment by 85%. Can you imagine? Yeah.
Is that true?
Yeah.
No
So if I was a
way.
man, like on average, his chances of getting funding would be 85% higher. And that's insane. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that doesn't mean we're not going to be successful, but it's a shocking statistic. So also mixed teams don't do so well, right? So if you look at all the venture capital funding, I think it's like 2% that goes to only women-led companies, and then like I think 14% goes to mixed teams, and the rest goes all to men, right? And that's how like men keep the most money, like how it's always men that will have more money and stuff like that. So
Sorry.
yeah, it's honestly, yeah, it makes me like speechless every single time. And yeah, so what does this mean for like a woman like me, or for female founders? Well, it's a statistics, right? So you can do with it what you want. It doesn't mean that you're not going to be successful, but it is just harder. And I think it's also okay to acknowledge that. Of course, if my fundraise doesn't work, or if I'm not going to be successful, I don't think I would be sitting here and say, oh, it's only because I'm a woman, because I don't think that's true. But it is a part of it. And I think it's just like a part of every like female founder's experience in that space. So I think that's how you should talk about it, right? And how you can sort of shine more light on it. And yes, surprisingly, if you put more women on VC boards, they invest in more women. Very simple, right? So it is about like very simple, that relatability in a way. So yeah, but it's sad. It's a sad topic at the end of the day, because there's no progress on it really. Yeah.
Well, you say that, but I feel like we spent like some time talking about this issue, and what you're doing is very much being part of the solution. Because again,
Yeah.
coming to your events and being part of your community, we've had this discussion off camera a few times of how it's quite balanced. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't walk into that room as a woman of color and think, oh shit, like,
Yeah. Only white dudes. Like, nah. Yeah.
it's nice, and with the work that you're doing, you get to be part of the solution, which is what I'm trying to do as well with this platform. So my next question to you is, what have you had to unlearn from your research and from the way that you've been socialized as a young woman? What habits have you had to unlearn to strip that bias, not just from others, but from yourself, so that you can show up as the best founder, regardless of gender, background, whatever?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think regardless of whether you're a man or a woman, I think becoming a founder and putting yourself out there so much, and putting yourself into a lot of situations you've never encountered and never been before, you have to know yourself very well, right? You have to know, what am I good at? What am I bad at? What makes me uncomfortable? What makes me anxious? And that can be linked with my experience in society as a woman, but it can also be my personality and stuff like that. For me, when I was younger, I used to be a huge perfectionist. And maybe to a degree I still am. I think I've gotten a lot more chill with it, but and then also, like, obviously your cultural background plays into that. Like, German people like to be very pragmatic, and I think British people are more comfortable being a bit scrappy. And so like that sometimes also puts like not conflict, but a bit of a disagreement with my co-founder on like how much we should think about things before we do them. So that's like maybe my Germanness, my perfectionism a little bit in it. And he's much more comfortable being scrappy, which is good because that also means you're able to be fast. But you need to still think about stuff. So it's always like get sort of the sweet balance in between things. But for me, yeah, like unlearning that everything has to be perfect. No one looks at anything as much as you do, you know, like no one reads your work in much detail as you do. Nobody really cares that much. You have to be good at communicating the core value, and that's about it. I know there's lots of talks like Stephen Bartlett. He, for example, is very obsessed with like sweating the details and kind of caring about that 1%, which I agree to an extent. Like, yes, sweat the details and think about things in advance, but I don't think the attitude for young founders is good, that everything needs to be super worked out, need to be that shining 1%. I think it prevents you from executing quick, which is mainly what business is about, is that, okay, we're going to do this differently, now do it quick. And that's how companies grow quick, right? Just by doing it. And even if you fail and it doesn't work, you're going to, you know, hopefully learn from it and then do it better next time. It's going to be easier. So, yeah, it's like a balanced thing. But like the most important thing is always just getting stuff out in front of people. And like for me, unlearning that it doesn't have to be a perfect solution for me to test what I'm giving value to people. And every book will say that, but I think when you are living it, it's much different, you know. But every single advice that you get from how to start quick is like, okay, get a product or get a service or get a solution in front of people's eyes, ideally your customer bases, as soon as possible, to just see if it lands or not, even if it's imperfect. And that can be very comfortable for a lot of people. Very uncomfortable for a lot of people, I think. Yeah, I hope that's my take on it. But
no, very interesting. It's kind of this mentality of get going and then get good, like on the go, you know?
Yeah.
Which is very interesting. And it links to, so you've researched entrepreneurs, you've worked closely with so many entrepreneurs, successful people. You yourself are an entrepreneur founder. What common traits do you think you see in someone who is successful and going where they want to go in their mission? Because they're all doing different things, working to solve different problems, working with different markets and customer bases. But what do you think is kind of like the ingredients that one needs?
That's a very hard question. I think there's founders with very different personalities, and there isn't sort of the one archetype that I would say is very successful. I think on like the surface, the loud people get attention. So it can be good to be out there, and like it's probably like statistically harder if you're very introverted, right? Because you do need to be in dialogue with your investors, with your clients, with yourself, maybe with friends and advisors, right? Like the more people, everyone can help you, I think, make your business better. And everyone will maybe say an element about something that you haven't thought about, or that, like, you know, can just help you reflect. So I think the more people that you constantly talk with, the better. So yes, like probably extroversion to a degree helps. Also being comfortable with trying things out and failing, and like failing in front of people and not being the biggest perfectionist is good. And other characteristics beyond that, I would say it's quite diverse, because it really depends on the type of company that you're building, right? So different skills are very, very useful for different companies, and more like quantitative skills would be great for maybe tech products and stuff. And then like more soft skills like communication and leadership and all of that. And despite you need to probably have that too as a tech person, but probably for other positions and businesses it's better. My biggest tip is like not working alone. There are solo founders that are amazing, don't get me wrong, but I think I could never do it myself. I think it's good to work with someone else who you constantly are in communication with about your company. And even if it's not a co-founder, like maybe it is a close friend or like someone who is really updated on like what's happening there. And then, yeah, if you work with someone else, find someone who has complementary skills to you, and like that involves knowing what you're not good at, right? And sometimes that can be very easy, like, oh, I can't code, let me find a technical co-founder, which like I hear a lot, and it's like, yeah, hard. I always think it's hard because I think you already have a worked out idea. So I think it's hard to just go out with that and then just want to find someone who wants to build that. Because usually I think it's more authentic if you know someone who can code and then you kind of come up with something together. But the more worked out your solution already is, the harder it is to probably get someone really enthusiastic about it. Because you're more enthusiastic about immediate things that relate to us, right? Not like something that, you know, if it's a stranger basically in the beginning came up with. So yeah, it's tricky. I hope that kind of answered your question. But is there a one type archetype for entrepreneurs? No, people have very different personalities. But I think like extroversion and high EQ, I don't think it's just IQ. I think EQ is very, very, very important and very, very underestimated, because it's in the beginning, it's just people. Everything is just people. Your co-founder, your clients, your investors, right? Friends and advisors that vouch for you. If you're not a likable person, like no one will be supporting you. So I think that is more important than IQ, and you can get better at, you know, like more these types of skills. But EQ is tricky. And then even if you hire people, right, these first hires, if you're not a likable person, a good leader who thinks about yourself, people will not want to work for you. So I think people have high EQs that are doing really well for themselves, and maybe on a grand scale not. I think the main thing is like, for example, like an Elon Musk, like obviously his EQ is, I don't think, very high, but it doesn't really matter because he's not involved in the direct management of any of his companies. He's just like kind of the CEO media puppet on top, right? He doesn't really manage anyone at Tesla. Other people will do that for him that have these skills. So it's good to like look beyond that and sort of see that like real management is not that. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah. Hope that
Yeah.
hope
No.
that hit. Yeah.
I was gonna wrap up, but before I do, that makes me think of another question of like, how do you toe the line of being likable and not being a people pleaser? I think especially again, it's socializing as like being socialized as a woman. Like there's this element of you learn to be a little bit more agreeable, or like you learn a certain way to communicate. So how do you communicate like in leadership and management, your position of authority, while still being likable?
Yeah. I think I've had a very interesting experience. I would say maybe I am to a degree a people pleaser, at least in my more like personal relationships and my partner like relationships, because I think like, yeah, romantic relationships are always a bit different from like other relationships. But I think if you look at more traditional gender stereotypes, I would say I'm actually not not very much like what we would expect from someone who's socialized as a woman. Like I think I am a little bit like, I'm not the biggest people pleaser. I'm probably a little bit more not aggressive, but I'm more disagreeable than I am agreeable. Like I'll be very conscientious and see that I get my work done, but I'll sort of poke around in things and ask uncomfortable question in not always the sweetest and like unhinged way. I'm more like the person like that says no to stuff, or like says like, what are we doing this for? Like nice person, nice idea for a partnership, but what is this for? Whereas like my co-founder, I think like obviously he has like different types of traits, but I think he has like maybe more traits that are a little bit more like feminine, which has been really good for working with him because I feel like I can like, he's like a really nice person and he like listen well, and he has a lot of these qualities more traditionally associated with women, which I think are very important for men to have and to cultivate them. But then sometimes I feel like that I am more like the bad cop, and he's more like the yes man. And I don't really shy away from having uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable conversations. So yeah, I think like my personality, and that has maybe helped me to a degree, is that I don't constantly feel I need to please like every single client I meet. Sometimes I'm also just like, I don't think we can help you at this stage, and it's not going to happen. We this is beyond our capacities, and I don't need to give my everything into making you happy now. Um, yeah, maybe like that's more my co-founder. And that's really great because I'm more pessimistic and I'm more like, what's the point of this? And he's more like, no, this will be a great partnership, so at least listen to it and consider it. And like, fair enough, sometimes I am convinced. So I think it's very good to have like these mix of like personalities. But yeah, it's rough to be like a people pleaser in a professional context. I think it's very bad because I think you can fall victim to people who are incredibly narcissistic. And it's very, very important to have boundaries at work. And I think if you're a people pleaser, that's harder. It's harder to maybe say to someone, hey, I don't want to be contacted on the weekends. That's maybe my time for me, right? So yeah, I think if you know that you're a people pleaser, like think about self-preservation a lot, and like try to think what is good for me and what can I actually do, and like recognize when you're falling into people pleasing behaviors, like know that like, okay, this is like probably me trying to please them more than doing anything that makes sense for the business maybe. Yeah. But it's tough, and I think like, yeah, women are more socialized into being people pleaser. So yeah, it's good to just be aware of it and paying attention to it. I think that's half the rent, and then you can go from there. And it's also not something that you can change from one day to the other to be a massive people pleaser. So I think it's also about being kind to yourself and being forgiving, and like, it's not such a big deal if it happens, you know, you just learn from it and you move on. But yeah, I think that's sort of my take on it. Yeah.
Incredible. Well, I'm glad that you're navigating that well, and thank you so much for sharing all your insight and some of these shocking statistics.
Yeah.
I feel like some of the stuff that we've talked about is a little bit, I don't want to say negative, but
No, not negative.
we've drawn like, maybe it's not the most optimistic.
Yeah.
And so I like to always end the podcast with a theme of gratitude. So can you please share with us today what you feel really grateful for?
Oh, that's a good one. I'm very grateful for my like friends and family, because I think like obviously beyond my co-founder, who's very supportive and who also like endures my more like pokey nature of being like, what is this for? Why did we have this meeting? Attitude. It's like, I think having a supportive environment is the most important thing. And yeah, like having friends that see how hard you work and like, you know, share that with you, and who are there for you also for enjoyment and amusement beyond like just being a founder. I think it can be very all consuming, but it's so important to maintain an identity and to have a life outside of that. And yeah, I've been able to have that thanks to like very, very lovely friends and family. So yeah, I think that's why I'm always grateful for, and that I have parents who support me, I have friends who support me, and that's irregardless, I think, of how well I do as a founder. And I think that's really important. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much
You're
for
welcome.
everything,
Yeah.
for your time, your insight. You truly are an incredible and empowering woman.
Thank you.